Yes, now we can see the second slide.
Okay, good. So I was talking about the importance of the green cloak that Mother Nature covered our earth with. And it was this green cloak, complete with its grazing animals, that created all the natural resources that feed us today. You know, the topsoil that we need to grow food, and also there was water that these ecosystems actually helped create because they attracted rain. So I went through the 3 steps that David Wright identified as the kind of scenario that happened everywhere people went around the world as we started degrading the ecosystems. And the common thread was that net primary productivity, you know, the green cloak that was covering the earth, was diminished all through the defaunation period of the megafaunal extinctions, and then ever since farming was developed. In fact, farming probably accelerated that ecosystem decline and resulted in desert all around the world. And all of these places that are desert now, a lot of them used to be teeming with animals and had, you know, wet, humid ecosystems. In fact, under the Sahara, the Chad Basin, Lake Chad Basin, is a huge aquifer of water. So even under the Arabian desert, there's aquifers that they're pumping now to irrigate with. This water is 30,000 years old, and it was created when ruminants were on the landscape. So can people see my slide of Walter Yenna's YouTube videos?
We can see the links.
You can see the links. Good. So I recommend you take a look at these, because basically what Walter Yenna explains is how pastoral farmers, like many of you on this webinar, can be climate heroes by restoring this the green cloak of Mother Nature, because that will rebuild the natural capital that we've lost with what we've done. And I found holistic management really is one of the best ways to change how people have always managed our landscapes, which in the past have been degrading. So if we want to do the opposite, we have to change how we manage. And a lot of people think holistic management is actually about grazing, but it's about a lot more. It's it's about a way of making decisions that allows us to feed ourselves and be profitable today, but also rebuild the natural capital that our grandchildren are going to need to run their economies. And I think that's really important, to be good ancestors. And so, you know, the Herbal Leys are going to come into this, as you'll see. So I found, you know, one of my favorite take-home messages from holistic plant grazing, which is just a part of the holistic management, is that our livestock can turbocharge ecosystem productivity. In other words, by cycling nutrients faster on your farmland can be more productive. And that was really important. So does anybody see some photos of my cows? Couple of Jersey crosses. Good.
See them all.
What we did on our farm starting around 2007 is we started to lift the heights of the pasture our cows went into, and we also lifted our target residual. We took them out at higher residuals, especially in the summertime. And we just lifted a couple of inches a year, because there's a lot of things that have to change. And I always say Mother Nature takes her time, but she gets it all done. So because we wanted to keep our milk production at least the same, we didn't want that to go down, because we wanted to remain profitable. So we had a gradual lift, but it doesn't take long, a couple of inches a year. You know, in 3 years, a 6-inch lift is really pretty big. And we started moving away from perennial ryegrass and white clovers to more diverse swards. So this sward that you see, this photo was taken in 2016, 10 years later. We didn't plant any of these species. It looks like a nice herbal ley. You can see white flowers of the white clovers. There's red clover. There's also dandelion, who had their beautiful flowers in the spring that were yellow. But none of these seeds were planted. All we did was use the holistic plan grazing to get these herbal leys to appear. So it can be done, but that said, planting herbal leys makes things easier and go faster. So I know this might not be what you expect, but it's all going to fall into place in the end, and we'll focus more on the herbal leys themselves. But I just want to establish the big picture because, DEFRA with the subsidy program for planting the herbal leys, they want to see many of the same outcomes that we got on our farm. For instance, they want you to be able to grow more forage with less fertilizer. And we were able to do that on our farm because as we built carbon sponge, we grew a lot more forage for our cows in the summer. So much more that we were able to actually give up our grain supplementation and get on the grass-fed market, which actually increased our profits that way as well. We maintained our organic milk production at about 5,600 liters per cow. We're happy that didn't go down, but our costs went much further down, and that lifted our profitability. So we had much better health outcomes, less lameness, much less mastitis, and we needed 20% fewer heifers, and that itself was a profit center. We hadn't need to drench any calves in 6 years by the time I sold the farm. And we also had wildlife coming back, many species of birds, especially ground nesting birds. So we were getting the outcomes that, a lot of the outcomes that, the government wants to see with these subsidies programs that they're offering you. And one of the outcomes they want to see is a lift in soil carbon and that carbon being maintained. And holistic plan grazing can deliver that. So this is some soil data from New York State. I've graphed our soil samples taken on Raindance Farm in the blue, and from the baseline soil tests that we took in 2006 until 2017, we saw a lift of about from 6% to 8.5%. And testing was done later in 2022, and we found that the soil carbon was persisting. And we don't have a lot of data points, but the testing that was done in 2017, I think is quite robust, because Maple Hill Creamery, who was buying our milk at the time, did some baseline soil sampling on all their supplier farms. This farm tested the highest, and they took a soil sample on every 4 acres on the entire grazing platform. So I feel it was quite robust. And the interesting thing was we had some diverse hayland that we didn't let the cows graze because they were, not accessible. The soil organic carbon in those hay fields didn't go up at all. It remained around the 5.8 to 6% that we started with. So it was the grazing management that made the difference. Also, we hadn't changed our fertilizer program, so I'm pretty confident grazing management was responsible. So if you do the math on those percentages of increases over 10 years, we were sequestering 10 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, per hectare. This is 5 times more than the Amazon rainforest sequesters in its mature state. And that's important. And I'm not saying, you know, grasslands are better than the Amazon rainforest, because the Amazon, of course, contains in its entire biomass a lot more carbon. So we really need to preserve the rainforest at all costs for the sake of our grandchildren. But the rate of sequestration, in other words, the flux, the difference between what we absorb and what we emit, was a positive outcome. And it wasn't until I came here to the Southern Hemisphere that I learned why we had sequestered carbon so fast by managing for green grass, because we didn't let our plants over-recover. And Christine Jones explains how the liquid carbon pathway is so effective at putting carbon into the soil, especially down deep where it can remain for a longer term. And this study supports her work, and they found that living root exudates are 5 times more efficient at getting long-term carbon into your soil than just litter on the surface. And so why is the soil carbon important? Well, you know, the big advantage of it is it allows you to keep grass growing in the summer when it's harder to grow grass, especially if things get hot and dry. And when the young man who bought my farm passed on the soil data from the most recent soil tests in 2022, he noticed that even though they had a really dry year, the grass hadn't, you know, slowed down much, and he was able to keep the cows out grazing. And he thinks it was because of that carbon sponge that we had built up over time. So in the end, the importance of the Herbal Leys is to be as a tool to help regenerate this highly functioning agroecosystem on your land, and something that's going to build natural capital back that's been lost over the eons. This pasture was the last pasture that I regrassed on my farm. I think we regrassed it in around 2012 after about 5 years of holistic plan grazing. And I vividly remember plowing down the pasture before this and looking behind me and seeing the grasses go under, and they were quite diverse and of, you know, highly palatable species. And I was wondering to myself, you know, why was I regrassing 10% of my farm per year when I had developed so much diversity in it? So I sold the plows and my discs and my grass seeder and grain drill and never looked back. So notice, you know, the DEFRA scheme requires that you have flowering plants, especially in the summertime. And so we had that, even though we're managing for mostly green. We had lots of white clover. I planted several different types of white clover into this pasture, along with red clover. And we also have some tall forbs you can see on the right side, also flowering as well. So I think the point I'm trying to make is you can still manage for the quality that you need for your class of livestock and have the flowers. You don't need to let everything over-recover or even go to seed, because so many plants are going to slip through the cracks that they're going to provide plenty of flowering material for the pollinators. The foreground in this photo is actually our residual, what we were leaving behind on our grazing. So we were taking about half of our forage and leaving about half, and trying to trample what we left down to the soil surface. And I believe that it's better to trample green material than brown material, because the soil can assimilate it better without sponging up the carbon and taking it, the nitrogen, I mean, and taking that away from your plants. So I've listed some Herbal Ley practices in the order of their effectiveness to build soil. And holistic plan grazing is by far the cheapest and most effective, but planting perennial herbal leys is going to jump you up that that curve a lot quicker towards diversity, especially if you've got perennial ryegrass and white clover. We found those pastures were very difficult to manage with holistic plan grazing, and that is why we lifted them very gradually, so that diversity would come in before we got the covers too high. But if you plant herbal leys and get involved in the what I think is a great program that your government's offering, you can jump right away to higher covers and higher residuals and not have that gradual lift, and things will happen quicker and more easily, and it'll be way more fun. So the two practices that have the green bars next to them are for pastoral farmers, but for arable farmers, the last two practices, in order of their effectiveness, would be including diverse pasture into your crop rotation. And I recommend 3 years of diverse pasture if you can afford to do so, and make money out of livestock for those 3 years, while you have, while you're putting an ecosystem on your land to rebuild your soil, because soil in the first place was built by ecosystems. Cover crops aren't going to do that as quickly as far as building soil, but they will feed your soil in between crops. And I think it's a great idea. But notice I've separated the pastoral farming practices from the arable farming practices, and there's a reason for that. Here in New Zealand, a lot of pastoral farmers started planting cover crops, and actually, by taking area away from their grazing with the cover crop, they actually ended up overgrazing everything else on their farm, and it worked against them quite a bit. So in 2020, I asked Gabe Brown if he thought that in the pastoral farming context, it was a good idea to use cover crops, and hopefully you can hear what he says. If you don't hear the audio, let me know.
Next question, this one from a Northeast farmer. For dairy or cattle ranches, which are 100% perennial pasture, will the disturbance from diverse cover crops move them forward or backwards?
Okay, I want to make this point perfectly clear. There is no better cover crop out there than a very diverse perennial mix. So I get too many people, they hear me present and they think they got to go, terminate their perennials and plant a cover crop. Do not.
Oops.
Do that. Keep your perennials there. Now we want to add diversity, but what we're finding, that's why I put those slides in this presentation, through holistic plan grazing, through the use of stock density and recovery times, we should be able to stimulate a latent seed bank there.
So just to summarize that, so the lessons we learned on our farm is your land productive capacity will go up if you regenerate your agroecosystem. And by managing pasture to grow as fast as you can get it to grow, you can leverage that liquid carbon pathway to build soil. And mastering the tool of animal impact accelerates productivity by speeding up nutrient cycling. And you can use grazing planning to help grow your grass faster in 2 ways. It gives you control of your pasture recovery, and it allows you to lift diversity, which also is going to lift productivity in the long run. So all of these are very much connected. So I've covered the why. Now, what about the how? Please plant into a clean, firm seed bed. A lot of farmers in the UK were asking me, does it work to no-till into existing pasture that you haven't terminated with chemicals. And in my experience, that does not work well, especially if you've got any kind of competitive, well-growing pasture. So it's worth doing the proper seed bed. And higher rates are better because we want to have at least one plant per square inch so that you don't have bare areas where weeds can come up. We found it was helpful to use oats as a nurse crop in the spring. And what I did was I just ran the grain drill through with the oats and maybe some of the large seeded grasses. And then I followed with a brilliant seeder that put all the small seeds very close to the surface, which was nice because then everything got put down at the right depth. I don't recommend planting annuals if you're going to be planting something for the purpose of a perennial pasture, because if you put annuals in next year after they die out, you're going to have a bare spot, and what's going to come up? Probably a thistle. So I would avoid mixing the annuals in with your permanent pasture crops. So oats is a nurse crop in the spring at half the rate or less, 30 to 40 kgs per hectare. The oats is plenty because you don't want to drown things out. Cultipacting afterwards, if you use tillage, is good. And plant species that are suitable for your class of stock. For instance, if you're going to be set stocking with ewes and lambs, you don't want to have, Timothy and red clover and lucerne in the mix because they're just going to eat it out. And you're better off with, things like plantain and the like. And if you're an arable farmer, you want to plant cover crops with a purpose. And I'm not going to get into that because I'm not an expert in arable farming, but Gabe Brown, I've read Gabe Brown's book, and he covers the cover crops in detail, why to use them and which ones to use for different purposes. This is a sward that was planted here in New Zealand by Will Innes. And what I like about it is it's nice and thick. There's no bare soil showing. So, he'll have less weeds. He planted this at 40 kgs per hectare, which is quite high. I get this question all the time. Should I use full tillage to prepare the ground, or should I spray and direct drill? Which is better? So they did a study in Iowa, and of course, there's going to be costs of both of these practices. So we know plowing is going to emit a lot of carbon as you disrupt the soil, and it's going to damage soil biology physically, whereas no-till is going to damage soil biology chemically. But in this study, they looked at that carbon that was emitted with the plowing, and I was surprised that the carbon footprint of the no-till was so high as well. But if you look at the big picture of things, if you can use holistic plant grazing on this herbal ley after you establish it and sequester as much carbon as we did on our farm, it's going to be orders of magnitude more than the CO2 that you're releasing by the plowing. And that same study put this carbon footprint of arable farming into perspective. And it turns out soil erosion was the culprit for the most greenhouse gas emissions released from growing corn, wheat, or rape. And where the brown arrow is pointing, that's the mineralization after tillage. That's the damage from the plowing. CO2 that goes into the air, again, around 500 kgs per hectare. But it's even smaller than the carbon footprint of the fertilizer put on. So if you look at things in the big picture, it doesn't matter probably which way you go, but the question then becomes, do you really want to be planting that corn silage when it can be so damaging as far as soil erosion? Because remember, every time you lose soil to soil erosion, you're basically wasting the natural capital that your grandchildren are going to need to survive. And one more thing about the no-till, a lot of my friends here are no-till farmers, regen farmers, and they always talk about how their soil organic matter, their soil carbon is going up because of no-till, but there really isn't any evidence of that. In fact, I've always asked them if they have soil samples that prove that, and they don't. But there was a meta-study done that looked at no-till over 20 years all around the globe, and they found if you measure down to 1 meter, there's absolutely zero increase in soil carbon with no-till. So now I'd like to jump to, what should you plant? And this DEFRA program wants you to plant grasses and forbs and legumes, but Christine Jones differentiates the forbs, and she says it's important to have both tall forbs like chicory and short forbs like plantain as well. But why stop there? I took the photo on the right at Yo Valley Farms, their silvopasture project. So in this photo, there's also shrubs, vines, and trees. And eventually, people can start incorporating all of these into your agroecosystems to mimic how nature achieved really high rates of productivity. Here in New Zealand, Mark Anderson is planting oaks and nut trees and fruit trees right out in his paddocks. And what this does is it effectively increases the area of your green solar panel on your farm. I'm going to leave the different types of varieties up to Sam, because he's the expert on that in your region. But I do want to make some general comments. This study was done in New Zealand in the 1960s, and they planted different species of plants, grasses in monoculture to see how animals performed on it. They had wethers grazing, and Timothy performed the best by far in the summer. And I think the reason for that is we all know that Timothy is very palatable. The reason it's palatable for livestock is because it's high in energy. So definitely something you want to include. But notice that the tall fescue was the poorest performer. And on my farm, my cows basically didn't eat it. So I don't recommend planting tall fescue unless you know your livestock will eat it. It can be a little problematic and hard to manage with holistic plan grazing. But I was surprised in the study that in the summertime that the cocksfoot performed actually a little better than the ryegrass, which, possibly our varieties these days are better. But so you don't need to be afraid to put that cocksfoot in there. So these are drought-tolerant plants. Dandelion on the left, which is probably the most resilient forb in the world. You don't need to plant it. You're going to have it anyway. And red clover on the right. Perennial ryegrass is not drought-tolerant, as we all know. And what do these forbs have in common? A deep taproot. So that's going to be important if you've got droughty soils or you want to be drought resilient. So good, I hid that. So this is a pasture mix that I recommend down here in New Zealand. You're going to have more varieties where you are that you can plant. And I just want to talk a little about some of these. Bird's foot trefoil is going to be a lot more persistent and long lasting than something like lucerne, but it needs a special inoculant. You can't use the red clover inoculant with that, and Sam will be able to talk about that. Chicory is technically a perennial, but it doesn't actually persist long term. But it's okay to chuck in there. But eventually we found it goes away with holistic plan grazing over time. And that's fine. And of course, I list Timothy at the top as my favorite. You probably don't want to plant things like phalaris or prairie grass for sheep because they're just not suitable for those. So how do you maintain diversity of these herbal leys? This photo was taken at one of my clients here in New Zealand. If she starts managing her pastures like she used to with the proper management for perennial ryegrass, she will end up with just perennial ryegrass, and all this diversity will go away. So how you manage is really important. This farm has been using holistic plan grazing for since 2011, and they've developed this beautiful sward of lots of diversity and lots of flowers. One thing I do recommend is that you avoid over recovery, because that's going to favor the grasses over the legumes and forbs. And cocksfoot in particular can be problematic because it grows up and then it grows sideways, kind of like a flag. And if you allow it to over recover repeatedly, it's going to create bare soil next to it because it's going to kill the plants next to it. So you need to stay on top of it, and don't be afraid to grow green grass because that's what Mother Nature did. So when people studied the contents of mammoth stomachs, they were surprised to find that forbs made up a larger percentage of the diet than they ever expected. So at the time, you know, when Mother Nature had really highly productive ecosystems, forbs were allowed to grow. So obviously grasses didn't really take over, and things were kept vegetative enough for the forbs and legumes to grow. So if we are keeping things vegetative, how do you let the flowers appear that DEFRA wants to see to get payments from this Herbal Leys scheme? So on our farm with the holistic plan grazing, every month our pastures turned a different color. In the springtime, you know, the first flower out was the yellow flowers of the dandelion. After they went white and turned to seed, we started seeing purple flowers of red clover and hairy vetch, yellow flowers of bird's foot trefoil, of course the white flowers of the white clover. So it was just a beautiful sequence of colors over time. And the reason this happened is even though we were managing for green grass, there was always something that slipped through the cracks because we let the cows eat selectively and trample non-selectively. So that's happening here on Hamish Galloway's farm here in New Zealand. He's got the animals at a very high density in his grazing. They're making 2.2 milk solids per day as we speak. This photo was actually taken 2 days ago. And they're going into well-recovered grass, as you can see on the right. He's got flowers, and there's herbs and legumes in there as well. But because he's not asking the animals to take everything, enough slips through the cracks that it's going to continue to recover completely and go to flower. Even the grasses, some of the grasses will go to seed. So we found selective eating, but non-selective trampling to create the quality for next time was really important to get these flowers to happen. And it's really important to take control of your pasture recovery. And the best way to do this is with the holistic plan grazing, because the grazing plan allows you to achieve the recovery you think your pasture needs. Whereas if you have a feed budget app, which most dairy farmers do, for instance, that is using the grazing wedge that you grew last month to determine how fast your animals are rotating through your paddocks. So you really don't know exactly when they're going to come back to that paddock again. Whereas with the grazing plan, you plan in exactly when you want them to come back and achieve your optimal recovery. And that's the difference between the holistic plan grazing and the, apps that most people use that are actually feed budgets. So again, we want to achieve the optimal recovery for not only your plants, but also your class of livestock. And you decide what that is, you plug it into the grazing plan. And how I do it, which is a little different from Savory, is we do it on a monthly basis because in the springtime, we have much shorter recoveries we plan in, and then we lengthen those out into the summer. For instance, in July, you can plan on a 5-week recovery that the DEFRA program is requiring for these herbal leys to flower.
Siobhan,
So farmers that are using this grazing planning, this is going to be the perfect tool to get the outcomes that DEFRA wants. So for instance, in the springtime, you could plan in some paddocks to be set aside at spring surplus as deferred grazing. And that's another point in time where you can allow that 5-week recovery that's going to let a lot more flowers blossom and satisfy the requirements for the herbal ley subsidy.
hi Siobhan.
But you do want to
Quickly, can I
Yep.
just check quickly, are you able to wrap up in next 2 minutes, and then we'll just keep on track for having some Q&A period at the time at the
Yeah,
end?
cool.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep, sure, no problem. So it's important that you stagger, these 5-week recoveries so that you're not taking too much area out of your grazing round so that the animals get ahead of the grass on the other pastures. And the other thing with the grazing plan is then when the people from the government come to verify this program, if you're involved in the subsidy, you can show them where you've made these 5-week intervals to allow your pasture to rest and flower and recover and get the outcomes that they want to see. But the important thing of the grazing planning is that you can stagger things so that you've got enough pasture area to feed your cows as well. And if not, you'll know that you'll need to supplement or adjust stocking rates to make things happen. And I just want to quickly show how that might work in the springtime. You could set aside your herbal leys at spring surplus time, let's say in April or May. If you set aside that area and skip it, then you can get that 5 weeks recovery in there and have those paddocks come back into the rotation at the end of June when things might start drying out and you need more recovery time. So for instance, June, you might want a 24-day recovery instead of a 20-day recovery that might have been suitable in May. And then come July, all the area that you made into silage or had deferred can come into the grazing round so that you can extend the recovery on everything to the 5 weeks that the DEFRA program requires. And so this farmer is using the advice that the government's recommending for these herbal leys and eating them quite neatly, but I would prefer to see more residual left to feed the soil a little more. So that was just something else I disagreed with. This is some trampled residual on our farm. You can see lots of flowers in there, red clover, and again, like I said earlier, I think that the green litter is better than the brown litter, but it also provides a feed for your soil biology. So for farmers, arable farmers, if you're planting cover crops, I think it's important to graze those crops at optimal recovery too, because studies have found that with arable crops, the liquid carbon pathway pumps the most carbon underground in the first 1 to 2 months of growth. and then it declines rapidly as the plants go to seed. So for grasses, perennial grasses, it peaks at 2 to 4 months and then remains high for years and years. So I'll try to escape from this and stop my share and take some questions.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to do the questions all together at the end. I've been keeping track of the ones, so thank you to the people who put them in the chat. And so, yeah, thank you so much, Siobhan. And yeah, we'll come to those when Sam wraps up. So Sam, would you like to share your screen? He was in here. Oh, yes, I can see him. Sam, can you hear us? Okay, while we're waiting for Sam to figure out his technology, maybe we'll come to a couple of the questions, actually.
I know what happened. My presentation put him to sleep.
Okay, no, he's here, but I can't hear him. Can you say something, Sam?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, great. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Trying over there. Here we go. Great. Thank you, Charlotte. Really interesting. Siobhan, great to see some practical stuff on it. Really, really exciting. Charlotte, how long do you want me to go for? Is my question.
Are you okay to do 20 to 25 minutes, and then we can drag out Q&A for 5 minutes or so if people are happy to stay
You
on?
got enough time for questions? Yeah, perfect. Okay, I'm going to crack on straight in if that's okay. There we go. Okay, evening everybody. I'm Sam from Cotswolds Seeds. I do a lot of the advice here. We've been talking a lot about Herbal Leys. I'm going to briefly go into 3 areas today, and hopefully we've got a little bit of time for questions for myself and Siobhan. Basically looking at the benefits of Herbal Leys. I'm going to look at some of the species we might include in some of our mixes so we know why we're planting things and what they're supposed to be doing. And then briefly, again, some establishment tips for reseeding and a little bit touching on overseeding, but again, not too much detail for tonight. Okay. So my job is a seedsman, and it's really interesting. We speak to a lot of people on the phone all day long, and it's become very, very clear to me that the conversations I have are a bit like a checklist of people trying to do lots of different things with seed mixes and, of course, the species within those mixes. And they can be really varied, which is always exciting and really interesting. So, for example, people may be looking to get season-wide growth out of their seed mixes, usually looking to get a nice palatable mix as well with good grazability. They might be thinking about soil, which obviously is a big buzzword at the moment, so improving soil structure. High yield, possibly. Siobhan touched on drought resistance, carbon capture, another massive buzzword. Anthelmintic properties, so maybe reducing the worm burden for livestock as well, or low input reducing fertilizers. So straight away, there's a lot of things on that checklist, and I don't think any one species, any one single species can tick all those things. So suddenly we go back to what Siobhan was saying, which is combining different species together to get as many benefits as possible. So Herbal Leys, just to clarify, we've called them Herbal Leys for a long time. Some of the more recent scientific trials call them multi-species swards, diverse mixes. To me, it's all the same thing. It's combining a range of species together, normally based around the grasses, the legumes, and the forage herbs or forbs, as Siobhan said. So just to go over some of the benefits of these plant mixtures, I think the drought resistance one for me is really key. We're down in Gloucestershire. Some of our land is pretty thin, pretty dry Cotswold brash. So we're talking about 3 or 4 or 5 inches of soil and pretty much pure limestone. So suddenly you can see on these illustrations on the screen, those deep-rooted species, I'll come on to the species in a minute, can have a really important effect on the drought resistance of some of our mixes. And that's quite a nice snapshot, really. That's 2018, so that was a drought year on the Isle of Wight. And you can see in the foreground, you've got almost sort of heathland there. That was taken in July, burnt up pretty badly. On the right-hand side, at the back, you can see what is a ryegrassy sward, some dairy cows trying to find what they can on there, I think. But interestingly, at the back, in the centre, that's the Herbal Ley. So again, thinking about the slide before, with those deep-rooted species in them, you can see that drought resistance really starting to work, which is great. But interestingly, I think this is really important. Not everybody's on light land, and certainly in parts of the UK, not everybody is thinking about drought. There's a lot of heavy land. There's land that suffers from waterlogging, runoff, and of course erosion as well. We've seen a lot of water around this winter just gone. So I think these deep-rooted species can actually improve or help to improve soil infiltration, basically. So getting that water off the top of the soil surface and down through the soil profile, helping to improve soil structure and hopefully reducing flooding as well. So just worth thinking about those deep roots when we're thinking about what's going on above the soil and below. Yes, light land and drought resistance is key, but I think on some of the heavier ground or ground that doesn't drain so well, they can also be really useful. I had a conversation a few years ago with a dairy farmer down on the Somerset levels, and they were finding that putting these deep-rooted species in, they were finding that the ground was drying out or water was getting away quicker in early spring. So of course that was reducing the amount of time they were keeping cows indoors, and that has a real knock-on effect in costings, of course, almost day by day and certainly week by week at that time of year. This is quite an interesting one. You've probably all seen it before. The green line is a grass growth curve, and that's the one that everybody's seen pretty much. As a rule of thumb, you tend to get in this country grass growth in sort of maybe end of March if it's a ryegrass, or maybe a little bit later, but end of March, April, plenty of growth in the spring if we get a decent spring with some moisture. But of course, in the middle there in the summer, we can have a real dip in production. Again, if we're relying on some of the shallow rooted species, this can be a real problem. And maybe a bumper growth in September if we get a bit of rainfall. Interestingly, if you overlay on the red line, that's actually a legume, so it could be a clover, for example, a growth curve for clovers. They tend to start their growth a bit later in the spring.
It's the end, but it is being recorded. So
when we're thinking about our diverse mixes, bear in mind that some of those legumes will take a bit longer to wake up in the spring as the soil temperature starts to warm and become consistently warm, but they tend to keep their growth going longer and later into the summer, filling in that forage gap because they tend to be drought resistant or more drought resistant. If you overlay the yellow curve there, that's the herb or forb growth curve. It shows a similar story. Basically, by combining these different species together, we can build in more drought resilience or forage resilience, seasonal growth in our herbal leys. We've dealt with herbal leys for a long time, and up until reasonably recently, it's sort of been yeah, they're all good, Sam, but where's the science? So I totally understand that. The nice thing is, as the interest in the herbal leys have grown, we've seen more trial work done. There's been quite a few different projects. There's one done in Ireland, the Smartgrass project, which showed some really good results with Tommy Boland. This one we were involved with, the SARIC project, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but basically they were looking at Reading University, Rothamsted and Duchy College, doing some field size trials on diverse mixes and how diverse these mixes should be. And within that, they were looking at live weight gain for growing cattle, a 5-year project. So they've really nailed into some of the details. So in terms of getting some scientific data, it's really nice to see some of the early results, which taken as a season-long growth, these multi-species mixes were as productive as their, if you like, control perennial ryegrass mix. And that's when the ryegrass was given fertilizer. Interestingly as well, they found the multi-species swards produce less methane. And from a soil health point of view, the multi-species swards tended to have more earthworms in them as well. There were other things they pulled out of the trial, but there's some sort of the key highlights. There's more to be disseminated. But the great thing from this was to see actually sort of satellite sites on 10 farms throughout the southwest. So we got some real good real life data from that particular project. Okay, I'm mindful of time, so I'll keep moving forward. You may have seen this man before, Charles Darwin. Now, he realized over 100 years ago that by combining different species together in a mixture, you could actually get an over-yielding effect or boost the yield of a single species on its own. If we take 3 distinct species in our potential pretend mixture here, so in this case, a grass, maybe a legume, so this could be red clover, for example, and a forb or a herb, so chicory. If we grow them for as long as we can. Of course, we're improving their soil structure and the fertility of our soil, as Siobhan said. But what happened, interestingly, with the Darwin theory, if you grew all three of those as monocultures, so straights as we call them, you've got about 12 or 13 tonne a hectare of ryegrass, about 8 or 9 tonne a hectare of red clover, and about 9 tonne a hectare of chicory. Now, if you add those up and divide it by 3, thinking about a mixture, you might expect an average yield of about 9 or 10 tonne a hectare. Can you see my Darwin thing? I've got it in my, actually, that isn't what happened. Darwin saw you had a consistently higher yield by combining the species together rather than the sort of sum of their monocultures. That's amazing that he realised that 100 years ago. There was a cost experiment, and that was done all over Northern Europe, and they were combining a very simple mix, ryegrass, and a ryegrass, cocksfoot, red clover, white clover mix, and consistently across the trial sites, they were finding that that mixture with no fertiliser was out yielding the simpler ryegrass control with fertiliser. So it's sort of what he saw, but years and years and years later. It took us a while to catch up. And where does that diversity in yield come from? Well, I think that's a really nice slide because it shows that not all plants in a mixture are competing for the same resources. For example, in this slide, you've got the yellow flowered bird's-foot trefoil in the bottom, or the white clover in the bottom of the sward. You've got taller species like the cocksfoot and the timothies. They're all competing for exactly the same resources as we might see in a cereal crop, monoculture cereal crop, for argument's sake. And of course, the same situation below the ground. We've got a really diverse root structure, deep penetrating tap roots, shallower lateral roots as well. They're not all competing for the same resources, so you can get that over yielding effect. I'll keep pushing on. Of course, bear in mind, if we are utilising the legumes, as Siobhan said, really important, we're getting free nitrogen, but we've got to remember that this only happens when the soils are warm. So in this country, it's normally mid-ish, end of April, probably, till about mid-end of October, maybe now in the autumn, and then they tend to go dormant over winter as the soil temperature cools down. And interestingly, there was work done that in mixes with legumes compared to grass-only swards, we tended to find that stock, in this case, lambs, were happier to eat the clovers and therefore giving them a higher voluntary intake. So you can see on this graph, grams a day, 250 on lamb growth on grass only, but 300 grams a day with legumes. So it could be with a clover, red clover, white clover, for argument's sake. So if they've got legumes in the mixture, they're happier to eat it, which is really interesting. Anthelmintic properties, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, just knowing that there are some species we can harness to try and reduce the worm burden in our animals. That figure at the bottom is a big amount of money, and some of these wormers are getting less and less effective every year, of course. So we've got to bear in mind if we can do it with species to keep the worm burden to a manageable level, that could be really interesting to explore as well. This was a difficult one. So I looked a couple of years ago into how some of these herbs may or may not improve the diet of our animals or livestock. And it was really interesting. I found the book on the right-hand side, which was written in the 70s, had a very small amount of work done by a seed company as to what some of these species, certainly the forbs, might be bringing in terms of minerals and vitamins. Fast forward to some work done in 2020 at Rothamsted, where they grew the forbs, especially in separate pots, and measured their minerals as well, mineral content. And there were some broad results that showed, and there were a couple of standout performers, that plantain and chicory seem to be pretty rich in most vitamins and minerals. Copper and iodine, of course, they could be too high or too low, were high in yarrow and alsite clover, as well as chicory and plantain. Selenium, interestingly, in the book from the 70s, wasn't even featured, but actually at Rothamsted they found that the chicory and plantain herbs had twice the amount of selenium than a ryegrass plant. Zinc was chicory and plantain again, which we see are rich in most things, but also legumes in general. If you've got cobalt issues, one way of addressing that might be the chicory, plantain and burnet. And interestingly, if manganese is an issue, they found that generally the grasses were higher in manganese. So it's not all down to the herbs or the forbs. But again, it just gives us a little bit of background. And I think there is more work to be done on balancing the nutrition for animals, but that gives us a bit of a start. It was difficult to find that research. Okay, so I'm going to go through the different plants we might utilise in our herbal leys. So I'll start with the grasses. The Pasture is really interesting. That's actually been some fairly recent breeding. Now, not much changes in my world when it comes to plant breeding. It takes years and years and years, but this is a more recent one. So what they've done basically is crossed a fescue plant, normally a tall or a meadow fescue, with a ryegrass. And the idea is you have the deeper rooted or stress tolerance of the fescue in a ryegrassy plant, which has the speed of establishment and palatability. The moment most Pasture tend to follow the ryegrass parentage, and they tend to be fairly short-term types, so almost like Italians, quite upright, not particularly leafy. But I think as time goes on, the breeding hopefully will lean towards a more perennial type plant. That could be really interesting from a grazing point of view. Ryegrasses we deal with all day long. Lots of choice, relatively economical to buy, lots of different varieties to choose from. But we know in dry areas they can really struggle in terms of their rooting isn't brilliant. Cocksfoot or orchard grass, as the Americans call it. Now, it has had a bit of a bad rep over the years, and throughout my year on the phones here, we get probably as many people positively talking about ryegrass as negative. There are newer varieties around that have been bred to be less coarse and clumpy, so making them easier to manage, which Siobhan alluded to. But look at that taproot from the illustration. In terms of drought resistance, and possibly building carbon or organic matter, certainly you can't really beat it. So I think Cocksfoot is a really important plant, but it does need some careful management. And like I say, the newer varieties, Donata, for example, are bred to be softer leaved and less coarse and clumpy. Timothy is a really useful one, long-term plant. We use it a lot over here. Arguably, it will grow on most soil types, but it really suits the wetter, heavier land. Very persistent and also high in fibre as well. So if you have got wetter soils, it could certainly be one to include, but I'd also probably include it in a dry land mix as well. It's a good all-rounder Timothy. And then, as I call them on the right-hand side, the two brothers, meadow fescue and tall fescue. They're similar plants, but even then, I'd say the difference would be meadow fescue tends to suit the heavier, wetter land. So again, if you're in that sort of soil type area, that one could be one to consider. If you're on the dry land, alongside with the Cocksfoot, you might consider the tall fescue plant as a deeper rooter. Take Siobhan's point on the palatability of the tall fescue. And again, as the interest in these more sort of niche species is growing, there has been a bit more work done on the breeding of them. So as I said about the Cocksfoot, we've got a similar situation with the tall fescue. There's been some breeding put into growing a softer leaved, less coarse plant as well. So that's really interesting to keep an eye on. Looking at the legumes, white clover and red clover you've probably all come across, but interestingly, look at the shape of the plants in terms of the white clover and the red. The white tends to creep out on stolons, so it's great for filling up the base of the sward, whereas the red clover tends to be more upright with a more penetrating taproot. Again, it can be overgrazed and damaged. In terms of drought resistance, the red clover does take some beating. In these last few dry years we've had, or dry periods, the red clover tends to stay pretty green. Alsite clover on the left-hand side there, it's an interesting one. It's a species, a distinct clover species bred in Scandinavia, tends to suit the heavier, lower pH soils. So maybe heading down towards the southwest could be an interesting one on those sorts of soils. Next to that is sweet clover, or yellow blossom, as the Americans call it. It's a biennial, so it is a shorter-term plant. But look at the rooting on thin, sandy land. It can be really useful, but it doesn't particularly persist after a year or two. Crimson clover I put in the middle there on purpose. That is an annual. As Siobhan said, be careful of filling up your mix with annuals because you will be left with gaps after sort of 6 months or so. But maybe a few of those here and there as a nurse crop or as a bit of a pioneer crop could be okay, as long as not relying on them to last into years, well, 1, 2, and 3 from the time of sowing. So just be careful about the persistency of some of these species. Birdsfoot trefoil at the other end of the spectrum, I think it's a really valuable plant. In some of those drought years in the last 3 or 4, it almost goes in a luminous green. It seems to be really happy when it's dry. It has the tannins as well that we find in tea and wine, so it can help to reduce the bloat and worm burden. So that's really useful. And then finally, the two in the middle, lucerne or alfalfa and sainfoin. Again, two stable mates. They're very deep-rooted species, traditionally grown as pure stands really for cutting, but I think certainly an important part of these herbal leys. But bear in mind, they are generally lighter land, free draining plants. That's the sort of soil they want to be on, normally with a high pH, so chalk or limestone or something similar. On the heavy wet stuff, they're probably not going to be very happy. Again, sainfoin has the tannin content, helping us to reduce bloat and worms. Lucerne doesn't have that, but it is a very drought-resistant, deep-rooted, high-protein plant. Okay, just to finish with the forage herbs, chicory we've talked about quite a bit already. In terms of deep roots, you can't really beat it, but it does have this bolting effect. It can get to 3, 4, 5 foot high on some grounds, so it can be difficult to manage, certainly in silaging situations, so just bear that in mind. The burnet's a really nice one, tends to stay fairly low and leafy, and again, a good drought-resistant species. Yarrow, you might say you've got yarrow in your fields anyway. This has been bred as an agricultural type, so a slightly bigger, bolder plant. But again, the idea is you're increasing the mineral content and the drought resistance of the sward. And then ribgrass or plantain on the end there. Again, a really important, easily available forage herb, easy to grow, deep-rooted, doesn't have the bolting effect of chicory, so it is easier to manage, doesn't have that woody stem to contend with. And then sheep's parsley on the end, a nice species, high in iron, but it is only a biennial, so again, it only lasts for a couple of years. Charlotte, do you want me to stop there so we've got some time for questions, or I can do another 5 minutes?
You can take another couple of minutes if you want.
Sure. Okay, it's just establishment, and then we're somewhere near. I'll leave that. Okay, so just a few things to bear in mind when we're thinking about establishing these herbal leys. We've got to be mindful that they're not a perennial ryegrass or Italian ryegrass ley. It is different, and we've got to be mindful of that when we think about sowing timings. So really, we're looking for warm soils, either in the spring, so from sort of late April, May maybe. The 1st of May down here this year felt like the 1st of April. It was still pretty cold, so just be mindful of that. And from an autumn sowing point of view, I'd be thinking mid-August to probably early September. So again, warm soils with a warm window ahead of them. If you do sow these sorts of mixes too late, you tend to find they become quite grass dominant because the grasses tend to soldier on better in the autumn when it's cold. It's the herbs and especially the legumes that tend to suffer. Generally dealing with very small seeds, so attention to detail is really key. Now, I'm not going to start an argument with how we should create these seed beds, but I would say the most reliable results we've seen are from creating a seed bed with good seed to soil contact. So breaking it down into a fine seed bed and a nice firm seed bed before sowing is key. How you do that, I'll leave up to you. Under sowing, again, Siobhan, I mentioned that was really interesting, or direct sowing, so creating a bare seed bed from scratch, or you could use it in the spring, under sow it to a spring crop, oats, barley, for example. One thing I would say, we find a lot of organic guys do this over here. Remember to reduce the sowing rate of the cereal, which again, Siobhan mentioned, which was great, to ensure that the ley, which is a long-term bit and the expensive bit in the bottom, have got plenty of space to come through. Some people will drill the cereal and sprinkle the ley on all on the same day, roll it well and shut the gate. Other people will drill the cereal and leave it 2 or 3 weeks, allow that to come up to probably 3 true leaves, no more than 4, and then scratch in the ley, which almost acts as a bit of a weed control pass at the same time. And finally, machinery, just be careful if you use something like that up in the top left-hand corner. That's a big bit of kit, and that could put these small seeds in really, really deep without even thinking about it. I would prefer something like the other 2 photos where you're either broadcasting onto the surface or just scratching into the top 10 mil. So 1 centimetre is maximum depth we're looking to put these sorts of leys in at. And I think this is one of the most important passes you can do from a reseeding point of view. Rolling, I've rolled it twice after sowing, especially with a set of Cambridge rolls like that, which are relatively light, or maybe a really good heavy flat roll. They always said you should be able to ride over a finished seed bed that's been rolled well on a bicycle. If it isn't consolidated enough, you'll soon know about it and end up on your side. And then finally, just to finish off, overseeding is interesting. We have done quite a bit of this and talk about it a lot. There is a level of competition there if you are adding to what you've already got and keeping the existing grass in situ. That can be tricky to get stuff established in. I've seen some good overseeds work and I've seen some bad ones that really haven't. The key thing is to cut or graze the existing sward as low as possible, and ideally harrow it out really hard so you're making enough space for the new seeds to allow your small new seeds to get up and get away. Time of year could be early spring if you've got a window. It might be after a second cut silage, or it could be end of August, early September. Just interesting to see the photo on the right there and how much residual grass that machine's going into. And I think that's too thick and hasn't been grazed down or cut and opened up enough. I'm not going to go into too much detail about overseeding, but we can talk about it later. And interestingly, as we said, there are sustainable farming options now. The SAM3 or CSAM3 is a really interesting stepping stone into these herbal leys, and I think is one of the most flexible options that pays well and allows you to cut and graze it as you want to do. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, Charlotte. Okay.
Great, thank you so much, Sam. Okay, I've been taking notes of some of the questions and I'm going to do rapid fire forms. So if you can be brief in your answers, and then we can try and let people get away roughly on time. I will drag it over a little bit though, just to make sure we get through as many as we can. So the first question I have is for Siobhan. So what was the stocking rate when you were at Rain Dance Farm, and did that change, I guess?
So our stocking rate didn't change. And that was one of the things we worked out with our holistic context, which includes quality of life. And one of the reasons we went organic was because we didn't want to milk 2,000 cows like the neighbors. So we kept our stocking rate the same. And that's how we were able to get rid of our grain feeding, because as we grew more grass, you know, we weren't needing more supplement in the summer. So we figured if we were gonna, you know, get rid of some purchase fees, we might as well get rid of the grain and get on that grass-fed milk truck to help, you know, help with that. So that was our approach, but it all goes back to, you know, quality of life. And almost all dairy farms I know are actually overstocked technically, because we use supplements to have that extra stock on the land, don't we?
Great. And what was your number of milking cows then when you were?
So I was milking between 80 and 100 cows, and we decided that's where we wanted it to stay. But that said, I was able to support, you know, 2 other households, you know, with my staff. And we were really happy that we could, you know, with just 80 cows, support 2 or 3 families. And that's exactly where we wanted to be. But we couldn't have done that if we weren't organic, for sure.
Great, thank you. And second question for you, Siobhan, is how long were your pastures rested? And then also the secondary question, especially over winter, did your rest periods change?
So, you know, in our context in New York State, we get -30 in the winter. It's a whole different ball game. So our growing season is 7 months long, and that's where it stops. Then everything else is frozen solid. So very different context from what you have, where you're almost like New Zealand and you can grow grass year round. That said, you know, often in your winter, it's too wet to put animals on it. You know, which I wouldn't recommend. But one thing we found out is, you know, some of the research that they did here in the 1960s in New Zealand, they found that with shorter rotations in the winter, so, you know, most people were doing, you know, 3 or 4 month rest for their pastures in the winter. But it turned out that here in New Zealand, they could actually get 3 grazings in the winter or 2 grazings in the winter instead of 1, and actually grow a lot more grass. And it didn't hurt the productivity of the grassland in the long run. So I do favor shorter recovery times in the springtime when grass is growing fast. And that's kind of one of Alan Savory's kind of insights. When grass is growing fast, you move your animals fast. And when grass grows slow in the summer, That's when it's super important to allow that recovery for your plants to fully recover in the summer. And it's the summer where almost all farmers kind of, everything turns to custard then, because if you're not on the grazing plan, that is going to tell you exactly how long your cows need to be in each paddock to get to the recovery you think you need. If you're not on that grazing plan and you're using a feed budget, as the grass grows slower, you move your animals faster, don't you? Because, there's less feed there. And that's what Andre Voisin calls untoward acceleration, where basically your livestock get ahead of the grass. So the grazing plan helps prevent your animals from getting ahead of the grass in the summer, which my cows always used to because I took off too much silage. So through the grazing planning process, you kind of think of ahead, well, maybe instead of taking so much silage or hay, I'll reserve some for that deferred grazing. And then in the early summer, when things start to dry out, you've got the area available to come in right away to prevent that summer overgrazing, which is the most damaging.
Great, thank you, Siobhan. Sam, question for you. So we hear a lot about good varieties for drought conditions, and could you provide any recommendations for the sort of wetter, colder winters we're having, or are a lot of those species equally helpful in both scenarios?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there is a little bit of crossover. So cocksfoot's always been known as a lightland drought-resistant plant, but it will grow on the heavier stuff. I think for me, if I was thinking about a handful of heavier westerland species, probably the timothy, probably the meadow fescue, Alsike clover, red clover, and then there's a little bit of difference with the herbs. I've heard reports of chicory doing okay on heavier land and wetter land. Other people say it doesn't seem to persist, and the plantain does better. So I think there's a bit of a difference between those two. But I think those species for me are probably the best ones. Even bird's foot trefoil on the lower pH soils again can be pretty good. So it's worth giving some consideration. I think try and tailor the seed mix to the soil type to get as many of those plants doing the right things as possible. There's no point having sampling on heavy clay, for argument's sake, knowing that it's just going to fizzle away really quickly.
That's a great answer, thank you. So we also had a similar question as well, which was, so how far has the performance of these commercial varieties of wild herbs been improved, such as bird's foot trefoil? And then a sort of subsidiary question to that also is like, are there commercial supplies of a species like meadow foxtail, which is quite productive and palatable on damper sites?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I think realistically, a lot of money has gone into the breeding of the ryegrass over the last 40 years, 50 years, much less in these other things. And we're starting to see a bit more now, like I say, with the cocksfoots, some of the tall fescues. So it's going the right way, but it does take a long time as well. So yeah, we've a long way to go away from the ryegrasses, which is where the money's been. Once you step into the world of more traditional species, so things like meadow foxtail, and then potentially into wildflowers and stuff like that, it can get quite quickly. So just a little bit careful there. There could be a cost element into the more sort of traditional stuff that is a bit less agricultural, maybe, and a bit more sort of more native or traditional.
Great, thank you. And then another question for you, Siobhan. I'm going to combine kind of two questions. So one person was asking about the removal of biomass and how do you keep that to the 50% that you recommend while still getting 100% of the trampling that you want? And related to that, I suppose, is a question of managing thatch and how do you avoid thatch impeding new growth?
Oh, that's a great question. And you do want to avoid thatch clogging up the system. If you get your grazing right, there should be no thatch whatsoever at the soil surface level about 3 or 4 weeks after a grazing, because everything that you trample down should get assimilated by the soil microbes if things are healthy. So how we create the quality, even though we're leaving so much behind, is by frequent shifting. So that photo I showed of Hamish Galloway, he's got his cows on 5 shifts a day. And that way the animals can be selective with their eating. But because they're so close together, it actually changes their behavior and they become a little more competitive. They're more animated and more trampling occurs. So he kind of increases the density just in the springtime. So we're coming into late spring, heading into early summer. And this is the key time of year to increase that density. So later in the summer, because he's got his quality established, he doesn't really worry about the mobbing so much. And he actually goes on holiday. He likes to fly model airplanes. So off he goes. And then the cows just get shifted, after the milking. And with dairy cows, it's actually pretty easy to provide more shifts. What we did on our farm is we just split the day paddock in half and the night paddock in half with an electric wire. And then whoever got finished, washing down the sheds after milking, they rolled up that reel. And, it only took 20 minutes to double the stocking density. So that's the secret of creating quality with non-selective trampling. And if you're focusing on keeping your pasture nice and green, then that green trampled material, it can be assimilated with your soil more readily. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you so much. So interesting to hear from your perspective. I'm going to do 3 more questions. So one for you, Sam. How much red clover can you put in a mix without causing bloat in cattle? Or how would you avoid that if you have a high proportion of clover in your mix, I suppose, as well?
It's a good question. I'm always very cautious with it. We've had instances of bloat, even in sheep, actually, over the years, on these very rich swards. So it's worth bearing in mind. You've got to be cautious. There are a couple of species that we could include on the right soil type that would hopefully offset some of the bloat risk. So the tanniferous ones, bird's foot trefoil and sandpoint, I'd probably be thinking of including both of those, or at least the bird's foot trefoil, if I wasn't on the right soil with sandpoint, to try and make sure I could mitigate what I could. I don't think there's a level really that I could say is okay or not on the bloat side of things. I think if there is certainly red clover and certainly red clover in the mix, there is a risk there. Time of year, conditions, is it growing strongly? Are we in June and things are growing really, really well after a dewy night? Those sorts of things are where it could be most prevalent. But again, it's a nasty thing once you get it. So you've got to be really, really cautious. You could say, leave the red clover to one side. That's another option. But even with some of the other clovers, the whites and the alsykes, there could be a risk there. So just be careful, I think, is the key thing, and maybe try and include some of the species that might mitigate it. Again, I think there is something to say that if you've got a more diverse mix with other things in than just red clover and ryegrass, which would be a very simple mix traditionally, you'd hope to mitigate the bloat a bit. But yeah, I'm still cautious.
Great, thank you. So I've got 2 more questions then. So Siobhan, and then the second one is for both of you. So the last question for Siobhan is, when you started implementing plant holistic grazing, what species, or did you notice certain species thriving and certain species disappearing? And also, what do the cows like best?
So that's a good question. And in holistic management, we talk about managing for what you want. So our target species, the one, we wanted to see the most of, was Timothy. So we were targeting for the recoveries that we're going to allow Timothy to thrive and so we could see more of it. And we did. And it turns out the conditions Timothy likes is the same conditions red clover likes. And if I may, I'd just like to touch on that bloat concern about the red clover. The only case of bloat I ever had on my farm, which is one case, was from white clover, because someone closed a gate when they took cows out of a paddock that was supposed to be left open, and the cows ended up then, after milking, going to a paddock that had only been grazed 2 weeks ago. So there was white clover in there that was very vegetative. If you're on a good grazing regime and providing, adequate rest, you shouldn't have to worry about bloat in general on your pastures. And, I don't think red clover would be the biggest thing to worry about. We actually grazed, we had planted a grazing variety of lucerne, and we were really worried about bloat there, but we never had bloat either, even though there was a lot of lucerne in that mix, and, you know, classically a bloaty combination. So it's really the grazing management that's going to allow you to avoid the bloat. You know, if things frost, you know, or, you know, heavy dews in the morning, you could feed a little bit of hay first or put them on a grassy paddock first if you're at all worried about it. So as far as the species we saw, we definitely saw a shift. We were trying to get away from the perennial ryegrass. And just a note on that perennial ryegrass, which I consider a weed now, in your species mix, I wouldn't put more than 25 to 30% perennial ryegrass in your mixes. You know, it does perform in the winter and the spring, which is good. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it is difficult to manage in these Herbal Leys systems and holistic plan grazing. So it's better to limit the perennial ryegrass. And as we favored, especially the springtime, the summertime, higher residuals that Timothy and red clover liked, they were able to start outcompeting the perennial ryegrass. So we ended up with, you know, going from mostly perennial ryegrass and white clover to about 30% perennial ryegrass in the sward, and then we had all the other species that came in, the Timothys and the cocksfoots, birds for trefoils, plantains that either came in or we seeded in.
Great, excellent, thank you. And so my last question to both of you, because I think maybe you have different perspectives from like different ends of the equation, I suppose. We had one question about docks and thistles proliferating, especially as a ley becomes older. And so do you have any advice on how to manage to prevent that or deal with it once it's an issue?
Can I jump in there? I think it's a really interesting one. As Siobhan said, I think with the less simple sward, so thinking about a ryegrass sward that has a lot of gaps in it, I think it does leave room for weeds in general. Putting pressure on the docks, which they're not used to with those long rooting systems, with sort of almost similar species, I'm thinking chicory, may help to keep it out, whereas normally it's sort of allowed to be a bit of a thug and do its own thing, because in a ryegrass sward, it's got shallow rooted grasses around it. There's no competition. So I think there is a bit of that in there. I have seen a situation a few years ago in an organic farm that was a real docky field. They planted it with a herbal ley in a dry spring. The chicory did particularly well, and by the autumn, most of the docks seem to have disappeared. And that I can only put down to the fact that the chicory is about the only thing that can possibly try and beat or match the dock roots, really, and put pressure on it that way. So that was sort of interesting situation. But I think that, yeah, not leaving too many gaps by filling it up with species, for me, is probably the one way to try and combat it.
Thank you. And Siobhan?
Yeah, so I've agreed with everything Sam has said. Thank you. That's really good information. But what we do with my clients is, if we've got thistles or docks that are predominant in some paddocks, we use those for deferred grazing.